Distinguished faculty members, members of the Oxford postgraduate community present here this evening, ladies and gentlemen, I say good evening to all of you. Indeed, it is a privilege to address you here at the Oxford University, an institution whose intellectual traditions have shaped global conversations on governance, leadership, law, political accountability for generations. Universities such as Oxford do more than just produce scholars. They build the intellectual muscle that actually shapes governments, institutions, and nations. And at a moment when constitutional democracy is under visible strain across parts of the world, spaces such as this remains essential for serious reflection about power, legitimacy, and leadership. The subject before us tonight is indeed an urgent one. And for West Africa, it is deeply consequential. Across our region, constitutional democracy is under pressure. Since 2020, West Africa has witnessed successive military coups in Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Guinea-Bissau, alongside attempted disruptions elsewhere. At the same time, contested elections, insecurity, economic hardship, declining institutional trust, and growing public frustration, especially among young people, have intensified pressure on constitutional governments that remain like ours. As president of Sierra Leone and as chairman of the ECOWAS, Authority of Heads of State and Government, I have witnessed these pressures very closely. I have sat in emergency summits after elected governments have collapsed. I have participated in mediation after constitutions were suspended. I've engaged leaders confronting insecurity, political unrest, economic fragility, and widening distrust in democratic institutions. So the conversation here today carries urgency. It also carries or requires honesty. I'm happy our young people have spoken so eloquently about the challenges we face. Because the greatest threat to constitutional democracy in West Africa is not only the soldiers who suspend the constitution. It is also about the slow erosion of public trust that makes citizens begin to doubt whether constitutional systems can still protect them, represent them, or improve their lives. That erosion of trust manifests in many ways, from disillusionment that creates apathy and low engagement with the democratic process, to support for military regimes that sometimes take over. So, ladies and gentlemen, when we see support among citizens for military coups in some West African nations, it is not that people have rejected democracy as an idea. What many people have lost is the democratic experience they have lived. They have lost faith in the democratic experience. We can see manifestations of that from our young people. They have seen elections conducted where hardship deepens. They have seen constitutions invoked while institutions weakened. They have seen public authority exercised without restraint, public resources managed without accountability, and public trust exhausted without concern. Democratic erosion rarely begins dramatically. More often, institutions weaken gradually through tolerated excesses, weakened accountability, and compromises that slowly become normalized until unconstitutional actors present themselves as the solution to failures they did not create, but are prepared to exploit. One lesson has been very clear to me over the years. Democracy is never self-sustaining. A constitution can be drafted in months. Elections can be organized in weeks. Institutions can be established by law. But democratic culture takes much longer to build. Restraint takes time. Public confidence takes time. The habit of losing elections honorably, governing lawfully, dissenting peacefully, and submitting to constitutional limits take time to develop. And unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, all of that can be weakened much faster than it was built. The real strength of constitutional democracy is revealed under pressure. When courts issue decisions government do not like. When elections are disputed. And when leaders discover that power still has limits. Democratic question in Africa, therefore, is not simply whether elections are held. It is whether African states can build political systems strong enough to command legitimacy without coercion, survive leadership transitions peacefully, and deliver dignity to citizens consistently. Nowhere is that pressure felt more intensely than during elections. Ladies and gentlemen, elections remain one of the greatest tests of democratic legitimacy in Africa today. Yet, elections alone do not secure democracy. What matters most is whether citizens trust the process enough to accept the outcome, even when their preferred sides or side may not have won. That trust depends on institutions, independent electoral commissions, transparent counting and verification systems credible enough. It also depends on credible courts. Political leadership that does not delegitimize outcomes before results are even known. When those foundations hold, elections strengthen national cohesion. When they weaken, elections become source of instability rather than instruments of democratic legitimacy. Ladies and gentlemen, I will not stand here and claim that Sierra Leone's democratic journey is without imperfections, or that my own defeat or victories were accepted by all without question. Before I got to be elected as president, I too lost elections as a leader of the opposition, and my party legally challenged the results of the polls, which we believed were marred by irregularities serious enough to question the outcome. When I ran again and won, the elections were contested by members of the opposition. What matters is that grievances were taken to court. Institutions functioned and disputes remain within constitutional bounds. That is not perfection. That is democracy at work. Democratic maturity requires allowing legal complaints to move through constitutional channels. It requires patience with due process, even when politics prefers speed. It requires respecting the opposition's right to lawfully challenge the outcomes. That discipline is not weakness. It is a foundation of democratic system capable of surviving contested elections, which happen all the time. This is also why questions such as the diaspora voting remain sensitive across much of the African continent. Broader participation strengthens democratic principles. But in practice, expansion depends on public trust and in the integrity and capacity of the electoral system itself. I've been struggling with this. I want our diaspora to be part of the electoral process, but my parliament will not allow me to do that. That is democracy. I am not the only person in Sierra Leone. A democracy that cannot inspire trust in how it counts votes. We struggle to expand who gets to vote. Our ambition as leaders should be built on electoral institutions whose credibility is so firmly established, so widely respected, and so institutionally protected that outcomes do not require perpetual external validation to be accepted. That is why in Sierra Leone, I remain committed to a comprehensive electoral reform process through mechanisms like the Tripartite Steering Committee, which undertakes both administrative and legislative reforms. Disputes will always exist, but mature democracies channel disputes through law, not violence, through courts, not coercion, through evidence, not incitement. The political class is directly implicated in this. How we conduct political life matters. How we treat opposition, civil society, and the press matters. We cannot personalize the state or intimidate critics, then appear surprised when doubt whether constitutional or truly belongs to the people. In addition to those who overthrow it abruptly, democracy is also weakened by those who degrade it gradually, who undermine the pillars of democracy. That is why regional bodies and international governments international organizations must look beyond sudden ruptures of constitutional order to the root causes of rupture. Ladies and gentlemen, as chair of ECOWAS, I have condemned unconstitutional changes of government, and I will continue to do so. Military coups are wrong, but if constitutional governments fail to govern responsibly, the potential for unconstitutional intervention increases. Every country that experienced a coup in recent years was already under severe governance strain. In Mali, public confidence in former democratic structures eroded as insecurity spread and the state struggled to protect citizens. In Niger, a historic democratic transfer of power in 2021 was reversed only 2 years later, reminding us that a single successful transition does not immunize fragile states against democratic reversals. The lesson is clear. Elections alone do not renew legitimacy indefinitely. Legitimacy must continually be reinforced through performance, accountability, transparency, and responsiveness to citizens, particularly on security and economic conditions. Let me take a moment to cite the case of Ghana, because it offers an important counterexample. Not because Ghana is without challenges, but because successive governments and institutions have consistently protected the credibility of the democratic process. That has compounded into durable public confidence. The infrastructure of democratic trust, built patiently over decades, has become one of Ghana's greatest national assets. I do not believe that West Africa is trapped in the democratic fragility that we talk about. What I believe is that we are living through a difficult but necessary transition towards stronger constitutional cultures, shaped not by imported templates, but by hard-earned lessons from our own history. In this, my country serves as a useful example. Sierra Leone's democratic journey is deeply personal to me. Our country emerged from a devastating civil war and began rebuilding democratic institutions under conditions of extraordinary fragility. There have been difficult elections and political tensions. This, in addition to economic pressures, has added to the moment of profound national strain since we gained independence 65 years ago. We are not a perfect democracy, and no honest leader should claim otherwise. But even in difficult moments, we have not abandoned the constitutional process. My own political journey, I must confess now, included a chapter of unconstitutional change. I hate to avoid that. I came to power for the first time through military rule. But in 1996, in the middle of a civil war, I thought it necessary to hand over power to an elected civilian government. Many believed then that the country was too unstable for democratic transition and that military authority should continue. But I came to believe that even an imperfect democratic mandate offered Sierra Leone a much stronger basis for legitimacy than prolonged military rule. 20 years on, I returned to leadership not through the bullet, but through the ballot box. I learned that the hardest act of leadership is not taking power. It is limiting it. Neither leaders nor nations can remain trapped in one chapter of their history. Leadership must evolve. It must evolve towards legitimacy and greater respect for constitutional order. I have governed under military authority, and I have governed within constitutional democracy. There is no comparison. I can say so authoritatively. Force may impose obedience temporarily, but it cannot build legitimacy. It cannot create citizens out of subjects. Only constitutional consent can do that. That lesson has never left me. Ladies and gentlemen, democratic erosion sometimes happens through tolerated excesses, weakened institutions, and constitutional compromises that gradually become normalized. As leaders, we face the real temptation to reward loyalty over competence and to treat criticism as hostility rather than accountability. Constitutional leadership requires resisting those temptations. And restraint is hardest precisely when power makes restraint optional. The true test of democratic leadership is whether leaders respect constitutional limits when doing so carries real political cost. ECOWAS has defended constitutional order across the region through sanctions, suspensions, and mediation efforts. And I promise we will continue to do that. But regional institutions cannot defend democracy only against soldiers while remaining silent when elected governments weaken democratic systems from within. That is why ECOWAS must deepen preventive diplomacy by strengthening governance benchmarks and speaking with the same clarity about democratic backsliding as it does about military coups. So, ladies and gentlemen, I also want to say a few words about the armed forces, the normal corporates. I speak here with a particular understanding because I served in the military up to the rank of brigadier. The armed forces play an essential role in protecting and defending the sovereignty of a nation. But political disputes are not military questions. We should not take it to them. Questions of election, governance, and leadership must always be resolved in accordance with the Constitution. And civilian governments carry their responsibilities too. They should have respect for constitutional order within the military. Respect for constitutional order within the military is strengthened when civilians themselves consistently model constitutional behavior. Doing so requires clear plans and the political will to follow through. Ladies and gentlemen, defending constitutional democracy in West Africa requires sustained and practical commitments. First, electoral credibility must be treated as a structural investment, not an event management exercise. Electoral commissions require institutional independence, predictable funding, and insulation from bad politicians. Second, governance performance must be taken seriously. Regional early warning mechanisms should track governance deterioration, shrinking civic space, declining public confidence, and insecurity before constitutional breakdowns occur. Third, regional institutions must develop both the tools and political will to address democratic backsliding by elected governments, not only unconstitutional seizures of power. Fourth, youth inclusion must become a structural priority. Young people will not definitely defend systems from which they feel excluded. And fifth, the international community must align its behavior with its democratic rhetoric. External support for democratic processes must not become external ownership of them. African elections must derive legitimacy primarily from African institutions accountable to African citizens. Democracies cannot mature if citizens believe democratic validation must always come from outside. We do not ask to be isolated. We ask to be respected as authors of our own democratic futures. Like I said yesterday, we should be authors of our own story. They've been told by other people for so long, to the point that we cannot understand our own story anymore. Of course, external partners have an important role in technical support and institutional strengthening. But the legitimacy of elections must ultimately rest with African institutions accountable to African citizens. The movement of democratic judgment belongs to the people themselves, especially to the young people who constitute the majority of our population. You've been asking for that, and on behalf of Africa, I'm giving it to you here. I will tell them later. To the postgraduate students gathered here tonight, you are part of a generation that will shape institutions across Africa and across the world. Many of you will one day face moments where principle and expediency stands in direct conflict. Some of you will become judges and will be asked to choose between law and pressure. Some of you will become civil servants and will be asked whether loyalty belongs to the Constitution or to personalities. Some of you will become diplomats and will be asked whether principle can survive political convenience. Some of you will become journalists and scholars and will be asked whether the truth is worth the discomfort. In those moments, your decisions will matter more than the words written in any constitutional document. Because democracies are ultimately sustained by integrity, courage, and the discipline of the people entrusted to defend them. Not easy in practice. Constitutions do not enforce themselves. Institutions do not defend themselves. People do. West Africa has buried too many young people, ladies and gentlemen, due to political instability, and that continues to date. Too many futures have been interrupted by conflict. Too many nations have spent decades rebuilding trust that should never have been broken in the first place. Constitutional democracy is always slow. It can be frustrating, I understand. And I know the Gen Zs don't have any time to lose. But it demands patience and compromise from those who hold power. But I've seen the alternative from inside. That is why I say tonight, with conviction, grounded in experience, ladies and gentlemen, democracy must endure. Because constitutional legitimacy remains the only durable foundation for peace, stability, and national progress. Our generation must ensure that no African child grows up believing that the gun, which I carried for a very long time, is the fastest path to power than the ballot. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the democratic responsibility our time has. Thank you.